So in sum, the influence of the first language seems to be selective in the sense of stages and subtle in the sense of weird properties of language like this. Many mistakes teachers point to are not L1 influence in learning, but the result of a production strategy. Teachers constantly put their students in the position of saying things that are beyond their competence. And the minute you do that, what's your communication strategy? Think in the L1 and slap some French, Spanish, German, Japanese words on it. If our competence doesn't have it in us for us to do, then we have to have some strategy for affecting communication. And so we get a lot of stuff out of learners' mouths that looks like L1 influence. But it's not influence on learning, it's influence on communication at that point in time. And that's the distinction I want you to understand here, okay? So a lot of what you see is because your students are in a position that I can't say this, I don't have it in my head, or it's not robustly represented enough that I can pull it down and fast enough in real time to do it for you. So therefore, the easiest thing I can do is think in my L1 and slap some words on. Creating a mental representation is different from putting words in real time in speech. Those are separate processes that both are acquired differently. The one area where we do see consistent problems in L1, as you can probably guess, is phonology. That is the sound system. And we're not sure why. So people can show native-like abilities in syntax, lexicon, morphology. Henry Kissinger was a great example of this. Remember him from the Nixon days. He was indistinguishable native speaker in everything he did except his pronunciation. He was clearly a non-native speaker of English. It isn't always about aptitude either. Okay, I'm going to give you a topic to discuss amongst yourselves for a couple of minutes. Certain people are better at learning language than others. True or false? I want you to discuss that for 3 or 4 minutes with people next to you. Show of hands for the groups that said the answer to this statement is true. That some people are better language learners than others. How many said false? How many said, I just don't know, or I'm not sure? And what you see at the bottom here is this idea that there's such a thing as an aptitude test. And that's where I want to go for, because a lot of people believe in this construct of language aptitude. And it's still around, and there's still a good deal of research on it, some of which I'm going to tell you about in just a second. The construct of language aptitude has been around since the 1950s. There is consensus on the research prior to recently that aptitude is a significant factor in language acquisition. That is, language learning aptitude test scores. So when you take a test of language aptitude, and have you ever seen this test? The modern language aptitude test, the Carol Sapone test? Okay, well, we're not going to go into the details of it, but there's a test that's been around since the late 50s, early 60s, that when you take this test, it correlates with a variety of assessments and measures used in the research. Okay, these are measures of knowledge and certain measures of ability. But recent research suggests otherwise. So we got together and did this cross-linguistic study. So it's basically 4 experiments. So it was a large-scale study. We had something like 180 subjects. I forget how many we had at the end. And what the paradigm we used, the framework we used to look at aptitude and learning was processing instruction. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but it's a particular interventionist approach for formal properties of language that doesn't teach rules, but teaches learners how to process input. Okay, so the basic premises of processing instruction is learners miss things in input for various underlying psycholinguistic reasons. So if we can manipulate the input in particular ways to push their strategies in ways that are better than what they would normally use, we have an increasing chance that they're going to process those morphophonological units in the input. We talked about those of you who missed the first hour. And so what we did is we took the strategy, it was called the first noun strategy, which says that learners tend to interpret the first noun or pronoun they hear in an utterance as the subject or agent, which is a fine strategy if your sentence is John sees Mary. But if your sentence is John was seen by Mary, guess what? You interpret John was seen by Mary as the same as John saw Mary. Even if your language has a word-for-word passive translation like French and English do, for example. And even Spanish can do that. And then you get in a language like Spanish where we drop subjects and you can move verbs around. So you get lo ve Maria, which actually means Mary saw him, not he saw Mary. But learners think it means he saw Mary. They hear reflexive like se levanta. They think to say means he. So se levanta means he got up. They take any pronoun noun that comes in the thing before the verb, and it becomes the subject or agent of the sentence. So it can create havoc in acquisition. We looked at 4 different structures, how that strategy intersects with 4 different structures. In Spanish, it was the object pronouns in word order, so like Maria lo ve versus lo ve Maria. In German, it was case marking on articles, so like der Hund, so the dog hurt den Mann, so the dog hears the man, versus den Mann hurt der Hund, which means the same thing, but it's reversed order, which you can do in German under certain conditions. And Russian can scramble even more easily than German. So you can have dog hears man, and you can have man hears dog, but in both cases, dog is the subject of the verb. In French, we say, Leanne made, give a presentation to Bill. And when you ask learners who made the presentation, they go, Leanne, because she's the first noun in front of give a presentation. And they can't process that structure right. Aptitude tests. And what did we find? That there was absolutely no correlation. It was not a factor at all. So your score on your aptitude test did not correlate. It was not a predictor. Was not a significant factor. Choose any words you want for how you began to process those sentences correctly in Spanish, French, German, or Russian. Which is a significant study. This is in hearing language, yes. And these are also, guess what? Largely end of 3rd, beginning of 4th semester students at the college level. So they've learned all these things in the classroom before and relearned them, but they still can't do them because they don't have any representation for these things. Learners were in a laboratory where they were learning individually at the computer. So they heard sentences and they saw pictures. And they had to match a picture to what they heard. And the only feedback they got was, you're right or you're wrong, go on to the next one. And so, and that was half the population. The other half, in all 4 languages, the other half actually got explicit information ahead of time that told them, this is how this thing works in Spanish or French or German or Russian. And your mistake is going to be to think it means this when you hear it. So don't do that. That's what they got, right? Every time they heard a sentence, the computer tagged it, whether they got a right or wrong response. And what we found that in most cases, with the exception of only German and French that make a difference, that explicit information made no difference. So when you started processing and hear their sentences correctly, what they meant, explicit information didn't do much. We also found that aptitude did not correlate with when you started to process correctly as well. In a second study we did, which is under review right now, this is Megan Smith and I are doing a study in Japanese. It was a study of L2 learners of Japanese who had no prior knowledge of Japanese. So these studies suggest that maybe we're too quick about aptitude. And why would these studies suggest that? Because these 2 studies are fundamentally different from previous research. Aptitude is very, very clearly correlates with outcomes measured when the learning is explicit. Okay, so you teach rules and you test rules. But remember, my paradigm says there are no rules to be learned. So in the first experiment with Russian, French, Spanish, we weren't testing their knowledge of object pronouns or causative fair. We were finding out if they could process sentences correctly. If you believe that there's some kind of rule you have in your head and you teach a rule and then practice that rule, aptitude is actually predicated on that paradigm. It's an outdated paradigm. Aptitude does not correlate with measures related to implicit measures of representation or processing. So in the Japanese study, what we had them do was we gave them new sentences to read in Japanese that they'd never heard before, they didn't see before in their 100 sentences. But they weren't asked whether the sentences were good or bad. They read the sentences and then were asked afterwards a comprehension question. So they read the sentences and then afterwards they got a question that was about, for example, it would be like, Tato Apples eats something or other, one of those sentences I told you earlier. And then the question afterwards would be, is this sentence about someone in the kitchen? Yes or no? They were always focused on meaning. And what we found, of course, was they slowed down. Those who reset the parameters slowed down on the ungrammatical sentences as opposed to the grammatical ones, showing some kind of underlying sensitivity when their focus was completely on meaning. This was a research paradigm we use in L1 research all the time.